Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Come on in. We just opened the gates, so we're going to spend a minute or so letting people filter in. If you can hear me, sit back, relax, just hang tight for a minute or so we can let everyone join us. And then we will start tonight's presentation on planning your testing calendar in the age of a worldwide pandemic with canceled test dates and new ways of testing. I know that our presenter tonight, Dr. Aaron, has some intel and maybe even some inside information that he's picked up here and there that he can sprinkle throughout his presentation tonight. We'll give a few more seconds.
Do what I can.
Yeah, we'll give a few more seconds. I see the numbers are still rising. And once our attendee number settles, we'll get started. And thank you for joining us, high school students who are maybe just keeping their eye on the ball for whatever your winter break date is and whatever your winter break will feel like. I think it's a little short this year just because Christmas Eve and Christmas fall on a Thursday, Friday. So I know some students are going to be in school up until that Wednesday, but we just take it one day at a time and we keep moving forward, and then you will get a break. It is coming. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. In more ways than one in everyone's lives. So we just have to keep moving forward. And let's, with that, go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure you have a lot going on and you have a lot of questions about a lot of things, but tonight we're going to be talking about standardized testing, which is a big part of what Prep Matters helps students and parents think about. And we're joined tonight by our Director of Education, Dr. Aaron Golumbfskie. He studied chemical engineering at Johns Hopkins, and then he moved over to UC Berkeley where he got his PhD. That's why we can call him Dr. Aaron. And not only is he in charge of all of our tutors, hiring, training, managing our however many tutors we have, a lot of them, he also tutors personally and has logged more than 20,000 hours of one-on-one tutoring, which is an incredible amount of experience. And he's probably seen everything under the sun and worked with a lot of different kinds of students through a lot of different, and it's not just the SAT and ACT that he helps with. He can manage a lot of tests and a lot of subjects. And so he's certainly an expert on this topic tonight. So Aaron, thank you so much for taking us through this information. And with that, I'm gonna hand the mic over to you.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. You're too kind. So let me share my screen here. You switch over, everybody can see that. Great. So first thing, I kind of want to set the stage with a sense of who you guys are. And from what I saw looking over the registrations, it was kind of a mix of sophomores and juniors. Seemed to be weighted a little more heavily sophomores than juniors. So I'm going to kind of pitch my talk for that audience. If you are a sophomore and you haven't started this process at all, that's totally fine. You're going to get a lot of good information today. If you're a junior or the parent of a junior who has started this process or maybe have already made the SAT, ACT decision, hopefully we can still give you a lot of really good information to understand the difference between these tests and what your son or daughter is currently putting themselves through as it applies to one test or the other. So welcome, welcome, welcome. So first of all, I was planning on talking about the tests before the calendar, because arguably you need to decide which tests you're taking before you can decide when to take them. So here's our little steps to success, starting with the SSAT or IC or HSPT, which some of you out there may have taken already. But today we're going to primarily talk about that middle portion there, the PSAT, SAT, and ACT. Because those are actually the tests that are the primary metrics for college admissions. Those are the admissions tests. Sure, we've also got, as you can see farther along, the AP and the IB and the subject tests. Those, while may factor into admissions decisions, do so with far less importance than do the SAT or ACT, where we're going to primarily spend our time talking. But that's what we've got ahead of us. So why on earth are we even talking about these tests? Arguably because colleges care about them, right? I know those of you who have been to previous talks by our fabulous host, Jeff Knox, you're all well acquainted with this slide. He likes to show it for every talk, and pretty much so do I, for the same reasons, right? We care about this because colleges care about this. If you haven't seen this slide before, well, great. What we've got here is the results of a survey that was given to, oh, I don't know, 220 or so different colleges across the country saying, hey, what do you look for in your applicants? What's important to you? As you might have guessed, 3 of the top 4 here, all of the green rows, they're basically your grades, your high school grades. In this case, grades in all courses, grades in college prep courses, and the strength of your curriculum, that is what classes are you taking. So basically your transcript, right? No surprise here. The 4th one, right below, are scores on these tests. And you can kind of see that the colleges who rate these things of considerable importance is pretty darn high. After that, it drops off pretty fast, right? So primarily grades and scores, grades and scores, grades and scores, in that order. For those of you who came in wondering about APs or subject tests, we can also find those on the list. Somewhat infuriatingly, the AP and IB program here is actually listed under subject tests. I keep meaning to write the people who put this together a letter about that. And you can see that those are, gosh, most of the way down the page. And in fact, the last thing on this list is what they call SAT 2 scores. They used to be called SAT 2s, now they're called the subject tests. So, you know, for those of you who are getting really twisted over subject tests and, oh my goodness, do I have enough subject tests and are my scores good enough? It is literally less important than your state graduation exam scores, your work history, your interview. It's less important than everything, right? So try to keep perspective over those things. If we want to focus on something, it should probably be the things that colleges are focusing on, and those are SAT and ACT scores primarily. So why do we care about these? Because colleges do. At least they do until they don't, right? Some great number of schools are test optional. And I'm going to sprinkle in our COVID kind of adjusted facts here as we go. But in a non-COVID year, let's say last year, there were still a great number of schools across this country who were test optional. What that means is you can send in scores if you like, and you can not send in scores if you don't like. And some, by the way, really fancy schools are on that list. So most of you would recognize Bates or Bowdoin or Bryn Mawr or University of Chicago, one of the most selective schools in the country, has gone test optional. So what that means for students, if you like your scores and you think those say something good about you, great, send them. If for whatever reason you don't think your scores are very reflective of who you are as a student, you don't need to send them and they will consider your application just fine. Pretty much every other college in the country, except that you would know, I suspect, except for these, required SAT or ACT scores as of last year. Clearly in the middle of COVID, nobody's requiring them now. But it is interesting to read, right? Everybody is test optional, but some of the schools, if you read the press releases, it's kind of like pulling teeth a little bit. Cornell was a great one here. Princeton's was kind of the same, where they say, yes, it's test optional, but if you don't send scores, explain why. And sometimes you might have a very good explanation, but sometimes not. For those of you who are sophomores or rising juniors, right, or sophomores applying next year, you might be asking yourself, gosh, what's going to happen next year, right? Are our schools still going to be test optional for class of 2022? It's a little early to say that. I will, defer to Jeff on those matters. I will, however, say that a different Jeff Salingo, who tries to keep his tabs on these things, a former director of NACAC, he believes that very selective schools and flagship state institutions probably will not be test optional for class of 2022. However, many, many other institutions are. And by the way, I just picked the 2 handfuls here of the most well-known schools. If you visit Fairtest, which is a website that shows all of them, gosh, I think there are like up to about 1,000 schools here. Granted, some of those schools are, veterinary schools and mortuary schools, but they're schools and they offer degrees. But a great many schools are in fact test optional. So if it turns out that these things aren't for you, it's no reason to get bent out of shape. All right, that being said, let's dive in and talk about the tests, should you choose to take them. And since you're here, I suspect you will. We're going to start with the PSAT because that's generally the first thing that happens to you. In fact, if this were a non-COVID year, you would have gotten your PSAT scores back about 2 days ago, right? Some people who are on the call might have taken the PSAT. I honestly think it was just like maybe Potomac and St. Albans and St. John's and St. Andrews. And I think those were the only schools who offered the PSAT in the fall this year. A great many of you, sophomores and juniors, might have a PSAT coming up in January, which is lovely. The PSAT is a great way to test your readiness for the SAT. In fact, PSAT scores are very predictive of SAT scores. They're scored in approximately the same way. You might be asking yourself as a sophomore, maybe, gosh, should I study for the PSAT? Nope, wouldn't recommend it. I'd recommend taking it seriously and getting a really good night's sleep the night before, but I don't think it's anything you need to stress about or prepare for. Let's just see how it goes, right? Because there really aren't any consequences here. Colleges never see your PSAT scores. Doesn't matter how good they are, how proud you are of them, there is no mechanism by which you can convey your PSAT scores to a college or university. You could get perfect PSAT scores and you are 0 steps closer to getting into college, right? That being said, some of you may know that the PSAT is also the first kind of bar for admission to the National Merit Scholarship Competition. In fact, when you take your PSAT, it'll say on the front cover, PSAT/NMSQT, the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. So what you need to know about that is that in order to be a semifinalist, you need to hit a certain bar on the PSAT. The National Merit Scholarship Corporation, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that it's not a good look for all of its winners to come from DC and Chicago and New York and San Francisco. So what they've done is they've changed the bar based on the geography, based on the zip code, based on the state of your school. So the DMV is a lovely, lovely area, but you know, Northwest DC and Bethesda, they're very rough neighborhoods when it comes to PSAT scores. The bar here is incredibly high. So no matter who comes to me or what caliber of student, I never want anybody to get their heart set on this national merit stuff. That's the tail wagging the dog. The bar is so high here that literally anybody is like a head cold away from kissing that goodbye. Make 3 silly mistakes? Nope, sorry. Thanks for playing. But again, the good news is that this is just practice. We're really just trying to set up for the SAT. So if you can take it seriously, you'll have a great sense of where you are in terms of the SAT. So moving on to the ACT and the SAT, you know, for parents out there, you oftentimes are more familiar with SAT scores, which are back to the good old 1600 scale that you might have recognized. 2 SAT sections, evidence-based reading and writing, as well as a math score. Each of them out of 800 adds to a perfect 1600. On the ACT side of the fence, there are 4 different sections: English, math, reading, science. We're going to take a deep dive into all this later. And those scores are each out of 36, a simple average to give your composite ACT score out of 36. So for parents, if you took the ACT, you're probably more familiar with those scores. If you took the SAT, you're probably more familiar with those scores. Once you actually do take a test, or your student takes a test, and you look at a full detailed score report, there are lots of scores. The ACT will average some and come with an English and language assessment score. The SAT posts these cross-test scores in history and social science. I recommend you do with all of those scores what colleges do. That would be ignore them, right? We really want to focus just on the top line, right? In fact, most schools just care about the composite ACT or the total SAT. Clearly, if you're, you know, applying to Georgia Tech as an engineer, obviously the math score is going to carry a little weight if you're applying to a program that's highly STEM oriented, of course. So those are the scores. Does it matter which one you take? It does not. In fact, what colleges are going to do is simply consult a concordance. They're going to say this score on this test is equivalent to that score on that test, so everybody can be considered on the same footing. Right. So really, you're not handicapping yourself or your student if you decide that you're going to go with the ACT rather than the SAT. You know, every year, seemingly, I have a talk with a parent who is asking me, but Aaron, can my son or daughter get into a good school with the ACT? No, I mean a good school. I'm like, yes, sir, your son or daughter can. Where did you go to school, sir? Princeton, a good school like that. Yes, of course, you can get in anywhere with ACT scores. You're not handicapping yourself. You're really not. Simply consult the chart and that will be that. So the question that most students are asking themselves are, what are good scores, right? And I encourage you to take a second and think about that. In your head, try to think of what is a, maybe not great, maybe not amazing, but like what's a good SAT score? What's a good ACT score? And I ask students this all the time, and the numbers that they get back to me with just kind of amaze me, right? And it's just kind of a function of the fact that here we are in Montgomery County and Northwest DC, and everybody's just a little bit success obsessed, and scores kind of play not always the healthiest factor there. But I'll often toss that around, and a student might say, ACT score, I guess 32 is like okay. Or an SAT score, maybe 1200 is okay. And really, if we look at that, here's the actual truth. Here's the actual percentile distributions, right? That 32 that like a student said was like, I guess that's okay. Yeah, that's like the 98th percentile. Right? You know, that 1300 that a student is complaining about, yeah, that's in the 90th percentile, right? So just because of the populations we move in, we can sometimes have a skewed view of what's good and what's not good on this test, right? But really, in a more healthy way, what are these tests for? They're admissions tests. So the actual answer of what's a good score, well, a good score, and this seems like a cop-out answer, but it's really true. A good score is the score that puts you in the game and allows you to be a competitive applicant at schools you want to go to. That's what a good score is, right? Looking at it through any other lens is sometimes less than healthy, right? And I've seen, again, a lot of this. I'll start meeting with a brand new student, and I'll say, one of the questions I usually ask the first session is, oh, hey, do we have a goal, right? You know, what's our goal on the SAT? Where do we plant the flag, declare victory, and say we're done? And it's amazingly the specific answers that I get, right? I'll have a student and I'll say, what's the goal score? And they'll say 1470. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. And 9 times out of 10, it's because the older brother got a 1460, right? Not healthy ways to use scores, right? What's a good score? A score that gets you in the game at schools you want to go to. That's the name of the game here. So really, let's talk about now the kind of details and differences between the SAT and the ACT, because really, I honestly don't think students should tend to prepare for and take both. Right? I think there are better things to do with your Saturday mornings than take every standardized test ever created, right? Also, these things are sufficiently different from one another that sure, it's kind of the same set of skills, but they're definitely important differences enough that I would prefer my students make a decision as to which test is better for them, and then work hard on that test and not really look back. Right. I would rather us focus rather than divide our efforts and be conquered. So SAT versus ACT. Here's kind of what they look like. Again, the ACT 4 sections, English, math, reading, science. You'll notice that the SAT has a reading, has a writing, and the SAT calls it writing, the ACT calls it English. They're basically both grammar tests. Same thing, that's why I've put them in the same color. You'll notice, however, that the ACT has a science section, which the SAT doesn't have. That seems like an important difference. The SAT has a math section that does not allow you to use a calculator. That seems like an important difference. But the commonalities here are what I really want to focus on. And one of the commonalities is, wow, if you add this up, these are long tests, right? 45 minutes plus 60 minutes plus 35 minutes plus 35 minutes is more minutes than you want to be taking a test for, right? These are, you know, basically 3-hour tests. When you throw in the beginning and the breaks and the bubbling in your name, like the event itself stretches to sometimes 4 or so hours, and that's before any extended time accommodations that some of you might have. So one part of success on these tests is practice, 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 right? And part of that practice is actually practicing taking the whole test, right? How much experience do some of you students have taking 4-hour standardized tests? Not much. And it's not your fault, right? You just haven't done it before. Unfortunately, I don't know of any way of practicing 4-hour tests other than taking 4-hour tests, right? You know, success on these tests is as much, I can tell you, is as much about staying cool and keeping your composure and making good decisions over the course of that long test as it is about how much grammar or math or reading you know. So whatever plan you make to prepare for the SAT or ACT, make sure it incorporates full-length practice testing in either case. So one thing I might want to mention here before I get too much further into the minutia between the tests is, what do these tests measure, right? Are these intelligence tests? Are these IQ tests? No and no, right? When we look at and do the statistics on what these tests correlate with, do these tests even measure how well you're doing in school right now? Is there a good correlation between SAT scores and grades? Not really. Is there a good correlation between SAT scores and college grades? Also not really, right? So what are we doing here? Well, really, your high school grades are somewhat predictive of college grades. Your scores are somewhat predictive of college grades, but if we use your high school grades and these scores together, it's ever so slightly more predictive. But since college in this country is a billion and billion-dollar business, a little more predictive counts to these people. They can make slightly better admissions decisions when they have scores and grades combined, which is why they like to see grades and scores. But really, when we think about it, it's not measuring anything inherent about you. Right. So on one hand, these are bad tests. Like, I can't even tell you what they measure. But if they have one saving grace, it's that they're consistently bad, right? They're bad in the same way every single time, and thus they are something that can be prepared for, right? Can you think of anything at all that you can practice doing and not get better at? I'll give you a second. It's kind of difficult, right? And this is nothing else, nothing different from that, right? So if it's something you care about, if you're a sophomore or a junior out there, you've got plenty of time. Buy a book, get a tutor, take a class, right? There are lots of ways. If you spend the time, you will get better at this and your score will go up. Just make sure full-length practice tests are part of it. So if now, mainly speaking to people who haven't started the process, let's take a deeper dive in and try to understand which test is better for which type of person. So the first clear distinction between the tests is timing, right? Most of us would agree, who do this professionally, that the hardest stuff on the SAT probably a little harder than the hardest stuff on the ACT. And it's harder largely because it's trickier. But here's the catch. You have way more time to do it. The ACT, a much more straightforward test than is the SAT, but it's a lot faster paced. So just based on that, you might be thinking about yourself or your child. Are they the kind of person who, has a really great reading speed, can read super fast and can hang with the pace of the SAT or the ACT? That would be great. Maybe on the other hand, your student doesn't read so fast, but can think really deeply about some complicated things and not be fooled. Maybe that's SAT. But when we compare the timings here, you might have heard or have an accommodation for 50% extra time, right? Well, the SAT is already almost 50% extra time compared to the ACT. So very, very different experiences for kids taking them. The ACT is constantly a hustle. Nobody feels like they have time to breathe while taking the ACT. The SAT, plenty of time, but you just might not be enjoying yourself as much. Right. So that's probably the key differentiator. And by the way, for those of you out there looking for a silver bullet, it probably doesn't exist. Right. About half of the kids I see do approximately equally well, somewhere in the error bars, right, from test to test. That being said, a quarter of students definitely overperform on one test and the other quarter overperform on the other test. So it's worth the time to explore whether or not you or your student overperforms on one test relative to the other. Because really, I'd like you to have to prepare as little as possible, right? There are more important things to be thinking about and better things to be doing with your time. So if we can make this process a little quicker and easier for you, path of least resistance, I think it's worth your time to find it. So now let's start a deeper dive, kind of in a section by section way. And I'm going to start with the reading, because in my mind, the reading for me is probably the most important section that I think about when I'm trying to decide whether or not a student in front of me is going to be a better fit for the SAT or the ACT. because there are plenty of things really that we can change over the course of several weeks of or several months even of SAT or ACT prep. But honestly, basic reading skills and reading speed, not something we can change easily. So if they're a better fit for one or the other reading test, that could be an important piece of information. Structurally, these tests look very similar, right? The ACT, 4 long passages drawn from fiction, science, social science, humanities, natural science. The SAT, 5 long passages, 1 fiction, 2 science, 2 social science, very similar. And the passages are approximately equal in length. They have about the same 10 questions per passage for test. But like we said, the time is a really big difference. On the ACT, students have 8.5 minutes per passage. On the SAT, they have 13. So the little cartoons that I include here, though, are I think helpful to think about the differences between these tests. To make an analogy that will land for all my parents out there, but probably not my students, the SAT is to the journal as the ACT is to the USA Today. And if you've read those newspapers, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I'll say this, right? The SAT is more nuanced. It's more complicated. The text is more abstract. It uses a higher level of vocabulary. It's just more confusing to read. It's literally written at a higher reading level. The ACT, however, much more concrete, much more literal, fewer vocabulary words, easier to read. That being said, we have to do it a whole lot faster. So I back away from saying that one test is easier or one test is harder. You know, I've had incredibly brilliant students who just got frustrated by the tricks of the SAT and were much better fit for the ACT. I've had equally brilliant students who, for try as they might, just could not get comfortable with the speed of the ACT and did better on the SAT. Just kind of depends on how your brain's wired and your temperament a little bit. So other things to think about here is, yeah, you know, SAT, much deeper analysis. So what does it feel like to struggle on the SAT, right? Struggling on the SAT reading section feels like, oh yeah, great. They're asking me about this passage or about this paragraph 3. You look back and you say, oh yeah, I hated paragraph 3. I totally didn't know what they meant. Let me read it again. You read it again. Gosh, still not sure. Let me look at the answers. Okay, read the end. No, those aren't helping either. No idea what this means. That's what struggling on the SAT feels like. What does struggling on the ACT feel like? They give you fewer line references. They just ask you questions. So they ask you a question. You're like, oh yeah, I totally remember that. Wait, where was that again in the passage? Gosh, let me try to find it. Where was it? Looking at my watch, time, can't spend any more time on this. Guess I have to guess, right? So it just depends on your recall for surface details or your ability to like deeply analyze text. So hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of what the hard thing is about either test, all right? So from there, the section I think is kind of next most important when making the SAT or ACT decision, unsurprisingly, is the math section. And this is probably the section for which really the content of the tests diverge the most. Right? Reading is reading, but here it's literally a different set of math on these 2 different tests. I show or try to show in a bar graph, unscientific, I've totally eyeballed this and made it myself, but I stand by it. What relative fraction of the math problems come from each of kind of the classic high school math classes, right? And what we'll see here is that the ACT is really well balanced. There's a bit of algebra, there's a fair bit of geometry, there's some algebra 2. In fact, there's probably most algebra 1, algebra 2, and also a hefty bit of pre-calculus involved there. So the ACT pretty much is, you can think of it as kind of a pretty all-encompassing final exam in multiple choice form of all the math you were supposed to learn in high school before you got to calculus, right? On the other hand, the SAT, much more focused, and it's focused on algebra 1 and algebra 2. There's much less geometry on the SAT than the ACT. So by the way, if geometry was always your best math class ever, hey, maybe that's an ACT move. On the other hand, if you hated geometry and it just didn't work for you, maybe that's SAT. Also, one thing to think about, a lot less pre-calculus on the SAT than the ACT. So if you're a student who is kind of, you know, what we think of as more or less on level in math, right? Algebra 2 sophomore year, pre-calculus junior year, and you're looking to take the SAT or ACT early in junior year, there's going to be some pre-calculus on the ACT that you just haven't seen yet. can you deal with that or prepare for it with a tutor or with a book? Of course you can, but it's a factor to consider. Right. So the ACT, much broader range of math, the SAT, a much deeper dive into the questions that it does ask about. And of course, as the SAT, right, it's just a little wordier, a little trickier. The wrong answers are a little meaner, right? And then of course, the SAT has that one math section that doesn't let you use a calculator, which terrifies some students. Let me tell you that for sure. But I think kind of needlessly terrifies many students, right? The SAT is not interested in can you do your times tables, right? That is not what it's about. The no calculator section is not about computation. If you're setting up like 2-column multiplication or long division, you've already done the wrong thing, right? Not what it's about. Really, that no calculator bit, it's kind of aimed at this guy here, right? As an SAT tutor, and I've been doing this for, 15 years now, there are plenty of methods that we could help students use when they have a calculator to kind of get around doing the algebra for students for whom the algebra is not easy, right? Oh, use your calculator and pick numbers and test answers and do all these kind of tricks, if you will. The point of the no calculator section is to eliminate the ability to do that. The point of the no calculator section, if they were being more honest, they wouldn't necessarily call it the math no calculator section. They'd pretty much call it the math algebra section. They're trying to get you to have to do the algebra, because if the SAT is nothing else on the math side, it's about doing the algebra. So if you don't like doing computations, don't let that necessarily scare you away from the SAT. That being said, if having that calculator nearby, even if you don't use it, it kind of gives you peace, maybe that's an ACT thing. Right. So there you have it. That's the difference between the math sections. Moving on, English versus writing. And we said that despite the fact that those are different names, they're basically grammar tests. Right here, blast from the past for all you parents out there. Yes, that's a sentence diagram. If there are students in my audience, you probably have no idea what that crazy line graph thing looks like. Yeah, that's how we used to learn grammar back in the day. And here, it's a grammar test. Where do you put the comma? What verb goes with what subject? What pronoun goes with what antecedent? For many of you, this is going to need a little review, right? It's not that they teach grammar poorly at your school. It's that they just haven't taught it in 3 or 4 years, right? Most of the time when I'm talking to students, the last time someone gave them formal instruction on when to use a comma, potentially 8th grade, right? And now all of a sudden it's on a test that decides where you get to go to college. Great. But the good news here is, in my mind, this section is really the least important for me in making the decision. Why? Because it's the section that's most easily improved for students who are willing to do the work. Why? We said that this is a bad test. Can't even tell you what it measures, but the saving grace was consistently bad. Same thing every time. Nowhere is that more true than on this English or writing section, right? Why? If you think about it, we just said on the math section, there are just a myriad of problems that can be thrown at a student, right? An uncountable number of reading passages and vocabulary words almost. Here, really? It's pretty much the same 2 handfuls of grammar rules over and over and over again on either test. Sure, there are nuanced differences, but really for students who are willing to put in the time and drill and kill, I find that the English or writing score can definitely be consistently improved with practice. So if you take a PSAT or a practice test and it comes back that the English or the writing is the lowest score, put a smile on your face. It's the easiest one to improve. And again, sure, there are nuances. The ACT is a little bit more about punctuation. The SAT is a little bit more about flow, what sounds right. But by and large, they're both grammar tests. So less important for our purposes in deciding which test is the better test for you. They both, by the way, have an essay. Schools, by and large, don't really require the essay anymore. Actually, that's not true. The only school I can think of, and Jeff could jump in and correct me at the end if I'm wrong, the only school I can think of that most of you would know the name of that requires the essay is West Point. So if you can cross that one safely off your list, you don't need to worry about the essay.
He's right, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Jeff.
Academies.
Yes. So if you're not Service Academy bound, then really you don't need to worry about this. In fact, when we give students diagnostic tests, we really don't even bother with the essay. It's of little to no predictive value in terms of which test to take. And most colleges have decided it's of little to no predictive value in terms of how well you'll do at college. So most of them no longer require the essay. That leaves the lonely ACT science section, which has no counterpart on the SAT. And as I've described it thus far, the SAT is the tricky, confusing test, and the ACT is the straightforward test. And that's true. However, the least straightforward thing the ACT has ever done, in my opinion, is to call this the science test. It's not. Trust me. I've spent many years of my life, as Jeff might have mentioned, studying science, and this isn't it. So what's going on? Well, this test looks a lot like the reading test. So when we think about it, the reading section of these tests, do they ask you random questions about The Great Gatsby and The Grapes of Wrath and those other books you were supposed to have read by now? No, because it's a standardized test, and they can't do that because that wouldn't be fair because they don't know who's read what. Instead, they give you a passage. Hey kid, read this. Now answer the questions. The answers to all those questions, of course, are in the passage if you read it successfully. Well, the science section is the exact same thing. If they're being a little more honest, they call it the reading charts and graphs section. Why? Because they take the exact same tack. Hey kid, read this passage, but now the passage generally is a description of an experiment with its results presented in figures and charts and tables and graphs. The answers to those questions they're asking, they're all in the data. You just have to go find them, much like you had to go find the answers in the reading section from the text. Clearly, having an interest or an aptitude or having taken lots of science classes, will that help you contextualize the information perhaps a little more easily and happily and quickly? Sure, obviously. But it's not like there's any detailed scientific knowledge required, right? So for those of you out there who are science phobic or have science phobic children, it's no reason to run screaming from the ACT. And for my STEM nerds out there who might be saying, ooh, I'm going to take one with the science test. I like science. Don't be so sure of that either. So really reading charts and graphs more than absolute science. Again, some background knowledge helps. Worth mentioning that this is one of the sections on the ACT that's just super fast, right? So it's almost antithetical, right? My really good science students sometimes are really frustrated by the science section of the ACT because you just don't have enough time to understand what's going on, right? And in fact, I often tell my students, you have enough time, barely, to go back and find all the answers to these questions. However, you will never have enough time to either understand what you're doing or feel good about it. Crazy to me that they've designed a test this way, but they have. So science test, all about finding things in the data, not really about a deep understanding of science. Got it? So that, or those, are the primary differences between those tests in terms of their content. Some other things that might come into play, besides the content of the tests, are the policies of the different testing organizations. So let me list a few things that might come into play and might affect your decision outside the content. First of all, how to handle scores, right? Test canceling or test deleting. For the SAT, and I'll start with the SAT here, if you go and have a terrible day, right? Get sick halfway through the math section and puke all over your shoes, right? Yeah, you can cancel your scores. You can sign a form that day saying, I would really like this not to count, right? And then you can leave and it'll be fine. And it's no black mark, right? Colleges never know you took it. It's like it never happened. But you don't get the scores back. You don't get the feedback. On the other hand, the ACT will actually not let you do that. You cannot cancel your ACT scores that day because your ACT scores don't yet exist. ACT, on the other hand, believes in score deletion. That is, you own your scores. You can take the ACT once, twice, 3 times, however many times you like, and then write them a letter and say, hey guys, please delete the February test and the June test and just keep the December test, right? Totally up to you. That, for many students, is kind of nice, right? You get kind of all of the benefits without the drawbacks of having to cancel a score, or should I cancel a score? Do I want to see the results or not? On the ACT, you just take the test and, you know, as many times as you want, and then you cancel the ones you don't like at the end. So that's kind of nice, right? Also, I would say generally, if you're a student who has access or is entitled to any testing accommodations, the ACT has a far more robust set of testing accommodations. right? Can you get extra time on both tests? Of course you can. But on the ACT, there's multi-day testing, there's small groups and extended breaks, and it's just, there are a lot more different accommodations to be had on the ACT than the SAT, right? Here's an interesting one, and I've kind of crossed this out with a big red X, but I'll kind of fill you in on this little bit of inside baseball in case it resurfaces and manages to matter again. The ACT pre-COVID had a big plan. One of their plans was that they were going to make the ACT an online experience. You could take the test actually via computer, right? At a learning center, at your school, details to be released. And part of that experience was going to be single section retesting. That is, if you were really happy with your math score and your science score and your English score, but just needed to work on the reading, you could just retake the reading and that's it. SAT, no, if you want to retake it, you're retaking the whole test. Why might you, by the way, want to just retake one section or another? That gets into something called super scoring and score choice, and I don't want to get into all of the gory details here, but suffice to say, it's a different story for kids now than it was, if any parents are in the audience, when you guys did this, right? Back when we took the SAT and sent our scores, right? Every test I ever took, every SAT, every subject test, back in the day, they were called achievements tests when I did it, right? All of that went in one big happy bundle to the colleges to which I applied. Nowadays, kids have choice. I'm going to send the December test, but not the June test. I'm going to send the March test, but not the April test, right? So students are in control of their scores, and colleges will often do what we call super scoring, right? That is, if they're given more than one set of scores, they'll kind of assemble the highest set of scores that they can to make that admissions decision. Not because they're being nice, by the way, but because they themselves want to look good, right? It is in the interest of most colleges to have the most impressive freshman class they can possibly assemble so that they can send off to the US News and World Report, maker of ridiculous lists, look at the very fine average SAT scores of our incoming class. So they will do whatever they can to send the highest scores possible. So when you, students out there, are comparing yourselves to average SAT scores released by these schools, either online or in the FIS guide or other thick college book you might be looking in, what you should be thinking of is those numbers are super scored numbers, right? So if you take the SAT or ACT twice, think about combining your highest sections, and that's the score that you should be really comparing to the percentiles that you're seeing online. Also, now we're going to start talking about calendar ever so slightly. The ACT calendar just tends to be a little friendlier. One of the reasons is that if you would like to take subject tests, which we'll talk about in a hot second, the SAT is given on the same day at the same time as the subject tests. That's a conflict right there. So if you're planning on taking the SAT and subject tests, a little more advanced planning is necessary because some of those SAT dates will need to be subject test dates. The SAT and ACT never given on the same day. So there are no conflicts between ACTs and subject tests. Also, for reasons that kind of are shocking to me, one of the SAT test dates is smack dab in the middle of the 2 weeks of AP season. It is always the Saturday in the middle of the 2 weeks of AP exams. Why they do that, given that they're both by the College Board, no idea, but it's true. The ACT tends to step around APs a little bit. So if you're really loaded down with APs and plan on some spring testing, that could be a factor. So just wanted to throw out some of those policy differences so that students can try to make the best decisions. So which test is better for you? You might be starting to form an opinion based on what I've said so far. I'm often asked to stereotype students horribly, so please forgive me for the next slide. When parents will arm me with 3 facts about their student and say, which test should my student take? It's really hard to know. I will generalize here for your help and assistance. The typical student who overperforms on the ACT relative to the SAT, the student who should take the ACT, the common profile there is the straight arrow, super hardworking, look at my color-coded binder, it helps me get all A's in school kid. Right. The classic student who tends to overperform on the SAT relative to the ACT is your smart slacker. Maybe I didn't do all the homework, but I want to look for the angle and do better on exams than my classwork grade. I like to do puzzles in my spare time kind of kid. Again, is anybody 100% one or the other of those stereotypes? Absolutely not. And I've seen plenty of times where those stereotypes get reversed. But if I were to draw, you know, some initial lines in the sand, that's probably where I would draw them. Yeah, the fast workers versus deep thinkers. Yes, that's true. Again, ACT tends to be more surface details. SAT tends to be a little more in depth. So again, those are stereotypes. They are what they are. The best way, of course, to know is to take a test. So I strongly encourage anybody wanting to make this decision, yeah, take a practice SAT, take a practice ACT, then you'll know, right? That comes with a little bit of a warning though, in that for students, I often see, if you just do a straight number comparison, the ACT kind of loses out a little bit. And let me talk about why. So if you go like take a practice SAT on one Saturday and practice ACT the next Saturday and just do a straight numbers comparison, sometimes that turns out to be a little SAT favoritism in a way that I often pull back on. One of the reasons is that if you as a student have already taken the PSAT, well, then you kind of know the deal for the SAT, right? Taking the PSAT, amazingly perfect preparation for taking the SAT. They're the same test, except the SAT is 15 minutes longer and 15 questions longer. The ACT, way different. So if you practice the PSAT and go into the ACT thinking that it's like the PSAT, it's not going to work out. Right. The speed is just super surprising for kids, right? So I often see students on their first cold ACT just not finish the sections. They're highly accurate. They just didn't finish. And if they had to take it another section again, like literally the next moment, just knowing that they had to go faster, their score would be very different, right? So keep in mind how those scores really were earned. And then finally, the science section. The ACT science section is just kind of wacky, right? If students haven't seen it before, it's the thing on either of these tests most unlike anything they've done in school. All right. So for that reason, I often see a lot of false negatives on the science section. Very often when students take a cold ACT, the science is sitting there like 4 or 5 points lower than every other section. It doesn't mean your student cannot ever improve on science. It tends to be a false negative. So as I say at the bottom, good means good, but bad doesn't always mean bad, right? Worth mentioning that for all of these tests, right? I don't know what the SAT measures, but gosh, if you get a 1560 on it, you got something. It's hard to say what it is, but you got it, right? Very few false positives, but there are just so many false negatives, lots of ways that you can not reach your potential on these tests. Really hard to say which test is better for students, with probably one exception. If you're entitled to extended time. In my experience, doing this for a great number of years, seeing a great number of students, I can think maybe I can put every student that was able to get extended time for both tests and those students for whom the SAT turned out to be a better match, gosh, on like one hand, right? It almost never happens, right? So if you do have extended time and the ability to get it on both tests, almost all the time the ACT is a better match. Why? Because what did we say the hard thing was about the ACT? It's just hard to finish in time. Having extra time by design is more of a help on the ACT than it is on the SAT. For many students on the SAT, they just have more time to look at questions that are confusing to them. On the ACT, they actually have time to finish the test, and that makes a really big difference. So if that applies to you, keep it in mind. So on to the testing calendar. These tests are given many times a year. These are, again, is a non-COVID slide. COVID's kind of altered the testing calendar greatly, but typically the test is spread out 7 times a year, all throughout the entire year. Things to notice here, there is a bit of a kind of an SAT testing desert that we are about to head into. Right. There's the December SAT and then nothing again until March. So the December SAT was actually last week and there will not be another SAT until March. There's currently an SAT next week, an ACT next week, and then one again in February. So the SAT is almost kind of like a fall season and a spring season. The ACT a little more well distributed. So when is the best time to take the test? A question I get asked a lot, and there's no one simple answer to that. I would say that the best time to take the test has less to do with this calendar and more to do with your calendar, right? When is the time you can be well rested and able to prepare and able to do your best? right? Often depends on what your extracurriculars are. What sports do you play? Gosh, are you a wrestler who's running around during the month of February, 20 pounds lighter than he should be and not able to sleep or think clearly? Probably shouldn't be taking the February ACT, right? Are you always involved in the fall musical, knowing full well that there's going to be those tech weeks in October where you're going to be at school until 10 o'clock every night? Probably shouldn't take a test then either. So think about what your personal schedule looks like before you commit to taking a test here or there. That being said, some other guidelines to think about. I tend, if you're a sophomore, if you're, so actually let me start with the juniors. If you're a junior, hey, now's the time. Right? It's not too late by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, on a normal year, lots and lots of students wait until they get their PSAT scores back, which by the way, would be about now. So starting now, totally fine. As you can see, several ACTs ahead of us in the spring, several SATs ahead of us in the spring, many options. If you're a sophomore though, you might be wondering, how early do I start? And I will get calls from parents of freshmen saying, can we start SAT prep? In which case I strongly send them away. Same thing with sophomores, right? Unless your junior year is going to be abroad or you're a Division I recruited athlete who needs scores immediately, I would not recommend taking these tests before junior year. I wouldn't recommend preparing for them at all until the summer after sophomore year. Why? What were the first 3 rows on that table I showed you? Grades, right? Make sure the sophomore grades are exactly where we want them. We don't want prep to come in place of that, right? And also, again, taking these tests, they're 4-hour tests, they're long. It's a certain level of maturity is required to be successful, right? So I think that really matters. The difference between 15 years old and 16 years old can sometimes be a really big difference for some kids in the ability to handle pressure and stay cool and make good decisions and commit to something and spend the time practicing. You know your kid, you know yourself. If you're a student out there, think about those things. But all that being said, my general recommendation for many sophomores is, sure, sophomore summer, great time to figure out which test is best, right? Use the time, hey, am I an SAT kid or an ACT kid? And then make your decision based on that. From there, if you are taking the SAT, you might want to start and look, or ACT, and have the math that you need to have for each test, meaning for the ACT, maybe a higher math level. Starting in the fall is great. Why? Well, you have all the summer to prepare. That's a really good use of your time. If you can spend the summer preparing without adversely affecting your grades, and you have the time in whatever summer plans you've got, please, parents, do not cancel like fabulous summer camps to prepare for the SAT. Bad move, right? But if we can use some of the time in the summer to prepare, that's lovely. Taking the test early can be nice because students know that they've got so many test dates ahead of them. It seems like for a lot of students taking it in the fall, there's just less pressure. College applications and thoughts are still a little bit down the road, and they can focus on the testing before worrying about the college admissions part of it, and that's kind of nice. Also, right, think about how busy you are if you're a sophomore in a typical sophomore year. Again, COVID, so you're probably not playing as many sports or doing as many activities as you usually do, but I can tell you that for most students, junior year, yep, way busier than sophomore year. Whatever clubs or sports you're in, you're going to be in a greater position of responsibility. That's going to take more of your time. Yes, you're probably getting more homework. You can't say you guys weren't warned about junior year. Everybody's been warning you about it for years. It's true. It's a lot of work. So the ability to kind of get these tests out of the way in the fall before AP season descends upon us in the spring, that can be kind of nice, right? So if we can make it happen in the fall, that's great. If not, and why are some reasons why not? Maybe you have kind of a late blooming kid who's just not there yet maturity wise. Maybe, we're not on an advanced math track and we'd like to just have a little more math class and a little more math under our belt. Maybe you play football and it's just really not a good time for you. Plenty of reasons why you might want to take it in the spring, and that's okay. Right. By the way, I often hear word on the street from kids, oh, take it in September because that's when all the seniors who didn't do well are like retaking it. And so the curve is better. No, sorry. Test does not get scored that way. That is a bit of urban legend. So there is no test that's easier or harder to take, right? So I've babbled on a lot tonight. Hopefully you've gotten some value out of that. I know we said this was going to end at 8, so I'm going to kind of gloss over the AP and subject tests a bit. As I said, they're really of far less importance to this whole process than SAT versus ACT. Is it something to worry about if you're applying to super selective schools and you'd really like to differentiate yourself? Great. It's not something you need to worry about now. Typically, students are going to take those subject tests at the end of the year after they've taken the class. So if you're in chemistry now and killing it, maybe you might want to think about a chemistry test, chemistry subject test at the end of the year. If you're a junior, yep, best time to take US history subject test, probably right after you've taken US history, right? But again, here's a list of schools who actually have subject test policies. That is, they recommend them. Nobody requires them anymore. Nobody requires them anymore. Here are some schools that would like you to take them, right? Anyone else? Really, you can send them or not. So again, it's going to impact very few schools, and the impact is not as great as nearly as great as the SAT or the ACT. So let's not get twisted about that. And finally, I do want to make one quick nod here to the effects of stress, right? I work with plenty of students, and much of the time that I spend with students is not necessarily teaching them how to use a comma or the equation of a circle, although I love talking about both of those things, but it's really helping students know themselves a little bit, right? It's really about getting them to put this whole exam in perspective, getting them to relax so that they can do their best, helping them feel in control and feel confident. Because when we feel in control, we're less stressed and our brains work better, right? So we don't want students to be totally unstressed, because totally unstressed means that they don't care, and that doesn't help performance, but we want to kind of keep them in the sweet spot. So if you're a parent listening, right, the best thing that parents, sometimes helpful parents, ask me what they can do to help, right? And what they can do to help is to be a supportive, non-anxious presence in their child's lives, right? That is always the best move as a parent. I myself am a parent, and I can tell you that it's easier said than done sometimes. But that's usually the helpful thing, so that students can really practice as much as they can and reach their potential, whatever that happens to be. So thank you very much for your attention tonight. I hope you've gotten something out of this. I am more than happy to entertain questions. You can always reach me via email, aaron@prepmatters.com. I talk about this stuff for a living, so I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it in detail if questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron. That was a lot of information. You just saw just the tip of the iceberg of Aaron's expertise. So he went through a lot of information. If you want to learn more, Aaron@prepmatters.com. I'm sure he'd be happy to chat with you individually about any remaining questions you may have. You could also contact Prep Matters directly. Our number is on the screen, and so is our educational planning department's email address. Speaking of calendars, of course, you're thinking about your testing calendar, but if you're interested in our next town hall, mark your calendars for January 14th, or no, January 17th, my apologies, the second Thursday of the month. In the year of 2021, we will be hosting town halls every second Thursday of the month, and the next topic will be high school course selection, how to answer the age-old question, what's better? An A in an honors course or a B in an AP course?
I would like to know the answer to that question.
It's a
I will
complicated
have to tune in.
Yes, please tune in and we will talk about that and more. Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you found it useful. Have a wonderful evening.